I remember how Maplewood Grove shone in the early morning sun on the day I moved in. The houses, painted in tasteful pastels, lined each neatly paved street. Maple trees dotted the sidewalks, their broad leaves providing pleasant shade. The real estate agent had raved about the uniform mailboxes, the squeaky clean lawns, and the sparkling pond at the development's heart. It was a neighborhood that promised peace and quiet, a place where someone like me, seeking calm after a stressful job in the city, could finally find rest. My small ranch-style house sat near the end of Sunflower Court, a cul-de-sac that gave me a sense of privacy. The first afternoon, while unpacking boxes, I noticed a sleek SUV parked outside. A middle-aged woman stepped out. She wore pressed khaki pants and a pastel blouse embroidered with Maplewood Grove HOA. Her blonde hair was expertly cut into a short bob, and she carried a clipboard. An odd sense of foreboding gripped me, but I shook it off as silly first-day jitters. This was, after all, just a standard HOA representative, right? She introduced herself briskly. "Good afternoon. I'm Karen Whitfield, the president of our homeowners association. I saw your moving truck and wanted to ensure you received the community guidelines." She handed me a thick envelope with the Maplewood Grove logo, smiling in a way that felt more practiced than genuine. I politely thanked her, saying I'd read them soon. Karen gave a tight nod. "We pride ourselves on uniformity here. Nothing unsightly allowed. If you have any questions or concerns, my contact info is in the packet. I expect you to follow the rules." Something in her tone, that note of authority, made me uneasy. But I told myself it was no big deal. HOAs had rules to keep things tidy, right? As she walked away, I couldn't help noticing how she paused to stare at a lawn across the street, like she was judging whether it had been trimmed exactly to the correct length. She jotted something on her clipboard and marched off. At that moment, I had little idea how her controlling nature would eventually disrupt a humble, charitable service for senior citizens. The first few weeks in Maplewood Grove passed calmly enough. Aside from the occasional email reminders from Karen about correct trash bin placement or acceptable porch decor, I found the neighborhood quite pleasant. My immediate neighbors, the Beckers, were friendly and told me that Karen had presided over the HOA for 3 years, micromanaging every detail. "She's big on community standards, that's her phrase," Mr. Becker said, rolling his eyes. Most folks try to keep their heads down to avoid her wrath. I listened, half amused, half concerned, but shrugged it off. I kept my lawn trimmed, refrained from any flamboyant decorations, and generally minded my own business. Meanwhile, I was adjusting to remote work as a freelance copywriter, so I rarely left the house except for errands. Maplewood Grove felt quiet, too quiet sometimes. Then, about a month after moving in, I encountered a situation that tugged at my heart. An elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, who lived a few houses away. I was out walking one morning and saw her struggling to push a wheeled walker down the uneven sidewalk. She looked frail, her steps unsteady. I offered to help, but she politely declined with a feeble smile, explaining she had to walk slowly to the bus stop for grocery shopping. That moment reminded me of my grandmother. Back in the city, I'd volunteered for a seniors' meal delivery program, Meals of Mercy, which delivered pre-cooked, healthy meals to older adults who couldn't easily cook or shop. I recalled how that service was a lifeline for so many. My grandmother used to say, "Those volunteers are angels. Without them, I'd live on crackers and cereal." The thought sprang to mind. Maybe Maplewood Grove could benefit from a similar arrangement, especially if more older residents struggled with mobility. The notion took root. I searched online and discovered there was indeed a Meals of Mercy chapter operating in this county. They offered free deliveries to qualifying seniors. All they needed was a reliable drop-off schedule, plus a volunteer coordinator to ensure safe, timely deliveries. My schedule was flexible enough that I could help coordinate. Eager to contribute, I reached out to the organization, explaining that Maplewood Grove might have seniors in need. They were thrilled to expand their reach. If I could handle the local coordination, identifying participants, scheduling volunteers, the program would provide the food. I felt excited. This was a chance to do something meaningful for my neighbors, especially the vulnerable ones. Little did I suspect that an HOA Karen would bristle at the sight of volunteer cars driving into her neighborhood, feeding a prejudice that threatened the entire charity effort. Within weeks, I had compiled a short list of senior neighbors who might benefit from meal deliveries. Mrs. Thompson was the first to sign up. Then I discovered Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez, an elderly couple with limited mobility. Soon, word spread among the older residents that a free meal program was available. I partnered with the Meals of Mercy staff to arrange a weekly schedule. The system was simple. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, volunteer drivers from the nonprofit arrived with pre-cooked meals in individual containers. They'd park near the recipients' driveways, ring the doorbell, and hand over the meals, often spending a few minutes chatting or checking on the seniors' well-being. Sometimes the deliveries happened mid-morning, sometimes early afternoon, depending on the volunteer's route. In total, about 8 or 9 seniors enrolled. The entire route took the volunteers maybe half an hour to complete. Initially, everything seemed to proceed smoothly. The seniors glowed with gratitude, each describing how the fresh, nutritious meals eased their struggles. I felt a warm sense of fulfillment, certain that the neighborhood would appreciate the caring spirit of Meals of Mercy. However, I hadn't reckoned with Karen's watchful eye. She apparently noticed the unfamiliar vehicles pulling up multiple times a week. One afternoon, as a volunteer named Lucia parked in front of Mrs. Thompson's house, I was across the street chatting with Ms. Becker. Karen rolled up in her SUV, scowling at Lucia, who was emerging from her car with a stack of meal containers. Karen lowered her window, demanding, "Who are you, and what business do you have here?" Lucia, startled, explained politely, "I'm delivering Meals of Mercy for Mrs. Thompson. It's a charity program that helps seniors with nutritious meals." Karen frowned. "I was not informed of any such arrangement. Outside traffic disrupts our quiet streets. I need to see if the HOA permits this." She turned to me, noticing my presence. "Did you organize this? You can't just invite random vehicles into Maplewood Grove without approval." I tried to keep calm. "Karen, these are volunteers bringing food to elderly neighbors who need assistance. It's not a commercial activity. It's a charitable service." She pursed her lips. "That doesn't matter. We have rules about solicitors or repeated visitors. If we let any organization waltz in, we compromise our security. Besides, it's an eyesore to have multiple cars parked." She tapped the side of her SUV door. "I'll be reviewing the bylaws. Don't proceed until we clarify this." And with that, she drove off, leaving Lucia flustered. I reassured Lucia to continue her delivery. But in my gut, a cold worry settled. Karen's meddling was no idle threat. She was the kind of HOA president who prided herself on enforcing the rules to the letter. I sensed a brewing conflict that could jeopardize the entire meal program. But I refused to let Mrs. Thompson and others go hungry just because a controlling neighbor disliked non-residents driving in. If necessary, I'd fight for this program. Sure enough, the next day, an official-looking letter from the Maplewood Grove HOA arrived in my mailbox. "Dear resident, my name. We have observed repeated visits by non-residents conducting a delivery service on multiple days each week. As you may be aware, Maplewood Grove bylaws require that any ongoing service or vendor entering the neighborhood be officially registered, with a permit obtained from the HOA board. Furthermore, to preserve our community's tranquility, large-scale or frequent deliveries are subject to restrictions, Section 5.3.1 of the CCRs. Please cease hosting this unauthorized service or submit a formal application for review at the upcoming board meeting. Failure to comply may result in fines or further enforcement actions. Sincerely, Karen Whitfield, HOA President." My blood boiled. She had twisted the concept of service or vendor to apply to volunteers delivering free meals. Meals of Mercy was not a for-profit vendor. They were a charity. But Karen evidently lumped them together with commercial solicitations, like a tree trimming crew or a cleaning company, who might indeed require HOA registration. That evening, I tried phoning Karen to talk it out. She didn't pick up, so I left a polite voicemail. No response. Instead, I got a second letter with even harsher language. You're disregarding the rules as noted. You must halt these deliveries or face potential fines up to $50 per day. Furious, I resolved to push back. I emailed the entire HOA board, addresses listed on the community website, explaining that Meals of Mercy was a nonprofit helping seniors, not a vendor, and that punishing them would be ethically wrong. Only one board member, Ms. Green, replied sympathetically. She wrote, "I'm sorry about this. I agree it's a good cause, but Karen is adamant about controlling all external traffic. She claims some neighbors complained about strangers in the area. I'll see if we can put it on the board agenda next month." Next month? That was weeks away. Meanwhile, seniors needed their meals. The next Monday, volunteers arrived as usual. Tension crackled in the air. A volunteer, Mark, told me that Karen had approached him earlier, demanding he leave, threatening to call the authorities. He was shaken but insisted he had a list of recipients who required their deliveries. I told Mark, "Keep going. She can't stop you from delivering essential meals." Yet I worried about the possibility of escalating confrontations. Could Karen actually barricade the street or summon the police? The notion seemed absurd, but with someone as controlling as her, I feared anything was possible. My worst fears proved correct just a week later. On a Wednesday morning, the day of one of the scheduled meal deliveries, volunteers discovered the entrance to Sunflower Court partially blocked by orange traffic cones and a handwritten sign reading, "NO through traffic, private road." Startled, the volunteers parked at the main intersection, unsure if they were allowed to pass. Mrs. Thompson's house and others were beyond that barricade. One volunteer texted me a photo. My anger boiled. This was a blatant attempt by Karen to physically stop the meal deliveries. She had no right to block a public or semi-public street, but I suspected she'd rationalize it by claiming it was an HOA-maintained private lane. Either way, it was an outrageous move, possibly illegal. Furious, I marched out to confront her. When I reached the barricade, I saw Karen standing by it, clipboard in hand, telling a perplexed volunteer driver, "This area is restricted to residents only. You can't enter without HOA permission." The volunteer, exasperated, held a cooler of meal trays, explaining they had a right to deliver to the seniors. Karen shook her head. "No, you do not. Maplewood Grove does not allow unauthorized deliveries. Turn around." Stepping forward, I demanded, "Karen, you can't do this. Seniors rely on these meals for daily nutrition. It's not optional. You're endangering their health." Her expression hardened. "Then maybe they should ask family members or authorized help. We can't have random strangers driving around. It's about security. My duty is to protect this neighborhood." I nearly shook with rage. Security? These are volunteers from a recognized charity. They're not random strangers. You're crossing the line, Karen. Her only response was a frosty glare. Another volunteer stepped up, pointing out that some seniors were homebound, with no family to assist. Karen refused to budge, repeating her mantra about HOA rules. The volunteers retreated, uncertain how to proceed. Some tried to deliver on foot, lugging heavy coolers past the cones, but Karen threatened to call the police if they trespassed. The scene grew chaotic, with a few neighbors gathering around, some shouting at Karen to remove the barricade, others watching in stunned silence. Finally, Ms. Thompson, frail as she was, hobbled up with her walker, tears in her eyes, asking how she'd get her lunch. Karen refused to engage, turning away. Outraged neighbors helped Ms. Thompson back to her house, but the meal deliveries for that day were largely disrupted. Some volunteers decided to park blocks away and walk, but many seniors missed their scheduled drop-off. The fiasco left me trembling with anger. Something had to be done. This was morally reprehensible. If Karen insisted on sabotage, I'd escalate by contacting the senior advocacy group and, if necessary, the local media. No way would I let her starve the seniors in the name of HOA compliance. Distressed by Karen's blockade, I made calls to Meals of Mercy headquarters, explaining the situation. They were aghast. The local coordinator, Angela, said, we've never encountered an HOA literally blocking deliveries. That's beyond normal conflicts. Angela put me in touch with a county-level senior advocacy group that had legal resources. They offered to step in, contacting the HOA on behalf of the seniors. I also phoned the local sheriff's office, inquiring if an HOA could erect barriers to block charitable deliveries. The deputy on duty sounded perplexed. HOAs can sometimes restrict certain commercial vendors, but actively blocking a street, especially for seniors in need? That sounds questionable. If you believe there's an immediate risk, we can send a deputy to mediate. I wanted to avoid direct confrontation with law enforcement unless absolutely needed. Instead, I pinned hopes on the senior advocacy group's formal approach. Their legal advisor, Ms. Calloway, told me, will draft a letter demanding immediate removal of any barricades that impede meal deliveries. Seniors have a right to receive essential services. If the HOA refuses, we can escalate to local government or file a complaint under elder abuse statutes. Blocking access to necessary nutrition could be framed as neglect or endangerment. Such strong language startled me, but Miss Calloway assured me they'd used it before in other contexts, like landlords refusing to accommodate senior tenants. She promised they wouldn't hesitate to involve the press if Maplewood Grove's leadership persisted. Armed with this new backing, I felt a surge of determination. Karen's stance was unconscionable. She might push the notion of security, but preventing charitable volunteers from delivering meals to homebound seniors was downright cruel. If she persisted, she'd face a storm of public disapproval. Meanwhile, I updated the volunteers. Hang tight, help is on the way. Word spread fast. Some neighbors snapped photos of Karen's makeshift barricade, posting them on local community forums and social media. Comments poured in, condemning her actions as heartless. Blocking seniors from getting food? Is she for real? One neighbor wrote. Others recounted how their elderly relatives relied on such programs. People speculated about the possibility of contacting local news outlets or even staging a protest. A handful of Karen's loyal supporters posted defenses. Our HOA must uphold rules. Strangers coming in thrice a week is excessive. However, these voices were drowned out by anger from the rest of the community. Even residents who typically avoided conflict felt outraged. Seniors? Food deliveries? This was no trivial matter of law and height. This was human welfare. As the controversy simmered, Ms. Green from the board quietly reached out, apologizing for Karen's unilateral action. She admitted the board hadn't officially approved the barricade. Karen acted on her own, claiming emergency authority to block suspicious vehicles, Ms. Green explained. We're scheduling an emergency board session to address the blowback. Karen, for her part, remained defiant, posting a statement on the official HOA website. She insisted that non-resident traffic soared recently, referencing volunteer cars. She repeated that Maplewood Grove prioritizes safety over convenience. She framed it as though the seniors could find alternative ways to get meals. The statement ended with, "We are open to discussing solutions that maintain community standards while respecting residents' needs, but random deliveries on a weekly basis cannot continue without proper oversight." That only stoked further outrage. Many neighbors recognized that seniors often have no alternative ways to secure daily nutrition. Ms. Thompson, after learning about Karen's statement, tearfully told me, "I can hardly walk to the mailbox, let alone carry groceries. She wants me to starve." My heart broke, fueling my resolve to see this through. The next volunteer day arrived with an undercurrent of tension. Would Karen try to block them again? Then came the news that the senior advocacy group and Meals of Mercy representatives planned to confront the HOA at the upcoming emergency meeting. The stage was set for a high-stakes showdown. A flurry of emails announced a special HOA board meeting on Friday evening to address community concerns about outside traffic and charitable deliveries. The community center, typically sparsely attended for routine business, overflowed with residents, volunteers, and a few seniors determined to make their voices heard. Some arrived in wheelchairs or with walkers. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Karen sat at the center of the board table, flanked by the other members, Ms. Green, Mr. Dewey, Ms. Tran, and Mr. Crosby. Karen wore her usual pastel blouse and carried her clipboard, tapping it impatiently. Facing them were the senior advocacy group's legal advisor, Ms. Calloway, and Angela from Meals of Mercy. I and a few volunteers also took seats near the front. Karen banged a small gavel. Order. We've convened to discuss the escalated situation regarding repeated deliveries by an organization calling itself Meals of Mercy. Let's proceed systematically. Ms. Green cleared her throat, quietly adding, we also have to address the barricade placed on Sunflower Court, which prevented volunteers from delivering food. Her tone suggested disapproval of that tactic, though she avoided naming Karen directly. Karen launched into a prepared statement. She claimed Maplewood Grove was a private community with strict guidelines limiting repeated external visits. She repeated that some neighbors felt uneasy about strangers pulling in multiple times a week, that property values might suffer if the neighborhood appeared open to unsolicited traffic, and that the barricade was temporary for safety. Angela from Meals of Mercy responded in a calm but firm voice, explaining their organization's mission. We provide vital meals to seniors, many of whom are homebound or have limited mobility. This is not a business. We are volunteers. We must have consistent access or seniors risk going hungry. She handed the board pamphlets detailing the program's background, volunteer vetting process, and proof that each driver was cleared by the nonprofit's security checks. Ms. Calloway, the legal advocate, took the podium next. Under state law and certain federal guidelines regarding elder care, purposeful obstruction of essential services can constitute neglect or even elder abuse, especially if it prevents seniors from meeting their basic needs. We hope to resolve this amicably, but we're prepared to pursue legal remedies if Maplewood Grove continues blocking deliveries. A soft gasp rippled through the audience. Karen's expression darkened. She retorted, "You're exaggerating. These seniors can get groceries or have family help. We never agreed to let random volunteer cars come in thrice weekly." She hammered on the word random as though describing criminals. Then Ms. Thompson slowly rose, leaning heavily on her walker. Her voice quavered, but she spoke with surprising determination. I have no family nearby. Without those delivered meals, I struggle. And Miss Whitfield's barricade forced me to rely on a neighbor's leftover soup for 2 days. This is beyond inconvenience. This is survival. Tears glistened in her eyes. Some audience members murmured comfort, while others glared at Karen in outrage. Karen tried to maintain composure. I empathize, but we must uphold community standards. She was cut off by Ms. Thompson's shaky but firm retort. Standards don't mean a thing if they starve us. A surge of applause and angry agreement filled the room. Others rose to defend the meal program. Mr. Dewey and Ms. Tran, board members who typically backed Karen, looked uneasy. Ms. Green, evidently on the senior side, proposed a motion that the board officially allow Meals of Mercy volunteers unrestricted access to deliver at scheduled times. She demanded the immediate removal of any barricades. Ms. Calloway insisted that if the board refused, she'd file an injunction. Amid the heated environment, Karen tried to salvage her position. We can't open the floodgates. Once we let these deliveries happen, who knows what else might come through. The audience hissed. Ms. Thompson's retort stung. If your biggest fear is good people bringing us food, you have the wrong priorities. The board voted. Ms. Green, Ms. Tran, and Mr. Crosby sided with the seniors, supporting an official motion to let Meals of Mercy proceed without hindrance. Mr. Dewey, pressured by the crowd, also voted in favor. Karen alone voted nay, scowling. The motion carried. The board declared the barricade must be removed, no fines assessed, and that the HOA would not obstruct the deliveries again. Defeated, Karen ended the meeting abruptly, banging the gavel and storming off amid a wave of applause from residents. Ms. Thompson wept with relief, hugging Angela. Ms. Calloway promised to remain vigilant, ensuring Karen didn't attempt further sabotage. For the moment, the seniors' victory seemed assured. But I suspected Karen's pride was wounded. She might not give up so easily. In the days following the emergency meeting, the barricade disappeared. Volunteers resumed normal deliveries, greeting relieved seniors. I witnessed tears of gratitude from folks like Mrs. Thompson and the Alvarezes. No more fear of missed meals. The board's official stance seemed to settle matters, or so I hoped. Yet Karen's resentment festered. She posted a scathing note on the HOA forum. Despite my best efforts to maintain a safe, exclusive environment, the board has allowed unchecked entry to Maplewood Grove. I only hope no incidents arise from this infiltration. She peppered the post with insinuations that these volunteer drivers might be criminals or cause traffic hazards. Many neighbors dismissed her fear-mongering, labeling it paranoid. But a few loyal supporters echoed her sentiments, praising her tough stance. Soon after, I discovered that Karen was selectively enforcing minor infractions against people known to support the meal program. Ms. Green confided that Karen had begun a spree of issuing petty violation notices. Your shrub is slightly over 2 feet high, or unapproved wreath on door. Meanwhile, residents who typically sided with Karen faced no scrutiny, even if their lawns were overgrown. This pattern was too blatant to be coincidence. Some neighbors contacted Ms. Green, complaining of harassment. Ms. Green told me privately, Karen is exacting revenge because she lost the board vote. We might consider a recall. But recall processes can be messy. Indeed, ousting a sitting HOA president required a majority of residents to petition, plus a special vote. Many neighbors dreaded the drama. Nevertheless, frustration rose. A group of us started discussing the possibility. Ms. Thompson, though physically frail, was vocal. If Karen's petty enough to punish people for feeding seniors, we should stand up to her. Others agreed, but we recognized the recall might be a last resort. Maybe Karen would eventually back down if her intimidation tactics failed. Meanwhile, the meal deliveries continued smoothly. The volunteers drove in, dropped off warm lunches, and left without incident. Seniors reported improved well-being. The senior advocacy group stayed on alert in case Karen attempted something drastic again. Little did we know that she had one more trick up her sleeve, something that would truly spark the entire community's wrath. Late one Thursday, I got a frantic call from Mary, a Meals of Mercy volunteer. She said, I heard from another driver that Karen's been talking to the county about restricting access to Maplewood Grove streets as private property. Could that happen? My heart sank. Was Karen trying to reclassify the roads to block public entry? Researching, I discovered that Maplewood Grove's roads were indeed private, built by the developer and maintained by the HOA. However, there was typically an easement allowing public passage, especially for deliveries and utilities. For Karen to legally bar non-residents, she'd need to prove that the association desired total exclusivity, like a gated community. Maplewood Grove wasn't officially gated. But if Karen lobbied to install a gate or passcode at the entrance, it could hamper volunteer access. Rumors flew that Karen pitched an idea to certain residents. If we gate our neighborhood, we'll raise property values and keep out random traffic. She circulated a petition. Some folks liked the idea of a private, gated enclave. Others hated it, citing inconvenience for guests and couriers. Ms. Green told me the board majority wasn't interested in gating, but Karen insisted on exploring the option. Around the same time, I learned that Karen had also contacted the local city council, complaining about dangerous traffic from meal delivery cars speeding or parking illegally. The claim was absurd. The volunteers always parked responsibly, never caused accidents. Yet Karen tried to create a false narrative of chaos, hoping the city might intervene. The cynicism behind her actions was breathtaking. She'd do anything to preserve her version of a perfect, closed-off community. Meanwhile, seniors' well-being hung in the balance. Realizing how far Karen might go, Ms. Calloway from the advocacy group stepped up pressure, warning that gating off the neighborhood to block essential deliveries would likely violate elder protection laws. The conflict escalated into a legal tug-of-war, with Karen on one side and a coalition of seniors, volunteers, board members, and neighbors on the other. With Karen's new push to gate Maplewood Grove, a groundswell of neighborhood opposition formed. Residents recognized that installing a gate meant fees, complicated entry codes for guests, potential delays for emergency services, and a general sense of isolation. Ms. Thompson and other seniors, plus families with frequent deliveries or visitors, strongly opposed the plan. Even some who once admired Karen's strictness balked at the cost and inconvenience. Mr. and Mrs. Alvarez started a petition rejecting the gating proposal. Word spread that if Karen tried to call a special vote, the majority would likely defeat it. Still, Karen pressed on, claiming, "We must protect property values and resident security. If gating the community helps, it's worth the cost." She made it a personal crusade, distributing flyers that vilified meal deliveries as evidence of outsiders flooding in. Meanwhile, the petty violation notices soared. People got cited for having a garden gnome or for letting a car tire rest a few inches onto the lawn. Ms. Green confided that Karen was using every trick to sow fear and compliance. But ironically, the heavy-handedness backfired. Instead of cowering, many neighbors rallied behind the seniors. They saw how unfair the fines were and how essential the meal service was. The volunteer drivers reported receiving supportive waves and thanks from most households. Only a small fraction aligned with Karen's extremist stance. Tension mounted toward another pivotal HOA board meeting set for mid-month. The gating proposal was on the agenda, along with further discussion of the meal deliveries. I braced myself for a major confrontation. The senior advocacy group, led by Ms. Calloway, prepared a statement cautioning that gating to exclude a legitimate charity could spark legal action. The local media also got wind, sending a reporter to interview seniors. One snippet of coverage showed Mrs. Thompson tearfully saying, "Karen wants to lock us away from the world. But we need help from outside. We're not criminals for being old." Public sentiment was turning sharply against Karen. She either didn't realize how isolated she was becoming or refused to accept it. Pride can blind people to reason, and Karen, it seemed, was the ultimate example of that. Days before the board meeting, a regional TV station aired a segment titled, "Meals Blocked: HOA Battles Charity Deliveries for Seniors." The footage included interviews with Mrs. Thompson, Ms. Green, a Meals of Mercy volunteer, and a short excerpt from the senior advocacy group's viewpoint. Karen was invited to comment. She declined, offering only a written statement about keeping Maplewood Grove safe from excessive outside traffic. The broadcast ignited a firestorm of criticism. Social media posts blasted Karen for endangering seniors' well-being over trivial HOA regulations. Many viewers called into the station, outraged at the thought of older adults being denied meal deliveries. The local editorial pages carried op-eds condemning HOAs that enforce rules at the expense of humanity. Some Maplewood Grove residents started discussing an official petition to recall Karen from the presidency. Ms. Green told me, "I've never seen such an outcry. Karen's tarnishing the entire neighborhood's reputation." Businesses near Maplewood Grove expressed frustration that a gating plan would limit customer flow. The senior advocacy group prepared to file a formal complaint if Karen continued her gating push. Karen, however, posted a defiant note on the HOA forum. She claimed fake news was painting her as a villain, insisted she was misunderstood, and repeated the claim that some seniors can rely on relatives or buy their own groceries. "We are not obligated to host endless charity vehicles." This attempt at damage control only fueled more backlash. Residents ridiculed her stance, calling it heartless. Ms. Thompson retorted publicly, "We have no close relatives here. Are we just supposed to starve if we can't cook?" Sensing Karen's diminishing support, Ms. Green confided that a recall motion was indeed in the works. She and Mr. Crosby quietly aligned with a group of neighbors collecting signatures. The plan, if Karen insisted on gating or further blocking the meal deliveries, they'd call a special election to remove her. The momentum built behind the scenes. I felt hope blossoming. Maybe at last, the community would dethrone the self-appointed queen of Maplewood Grove. At last, the mid-month HOA board meeting arrived. The community center was packed well beyond capacity. Seniors, volunteers, local reporters, and a large portion of the neighborhood turned out. Even some city council members showed up, curious about the gating proposal and the friction over meal deliveries. Tension hummed in the room as Karen took her seat at the board table, flanked by Ms. Green, Mr. Dewey, Ms. Tran, and Mr. Crosby. Karen hammered the gavel, instructing everyone to settle. We have two major agenda items tonight: potential gating of Maplewood Grove and ongoing concerns about non-resident deliveries. She glared at Ms. Green, as though daring her to object. Ms. Green nodded politely, letting Karen proceed. The gating discussion came first. Karen described her vision of a secure, exclusive community with a guard gate or passcode entry. She cited unsolicited traffic, suspicious individuals, and decreased property values. Many audience members groaned in disbelief. Ms. Green then read an opposing statement, pointing out the steep costs, the inconvenience, and the damage to Maplewood Grove's welcoming atmosphere. Senior residents and others would face burdens receiving deliveries or visitors. Ms. Thompson, in her shaky voice, declared that gating would hamper essential help like meals of mercy, medical visits, and even ambulance access. The crowd applauded. When the board called for public comments, a line of residents formed. They one by one denounced the gating plan. A handful supported it, claiming, "We want privacy, no outsiders," but the vast majority found it excessive. Mr. Dewey, typically Karen's ally, admitted, "I was open to it, but the cost and controversy changed my mind. Let's not turn Maplewood Grove into a fortress." Sensing the tide, Karen tried to salvage her stance. "We must protect property values. Gated communities sell at a premium." Another resident shouted, "Not if the whole country sees we starve our seniors. That kills property values too." Laughter and applause erupted, leaving Karen fuming. Finally, Ms. Green moved for a vote on whether the HOA should pursue gating. The board voted 4-1 against, with only Karen in favor. The plan died on the spot, prompting cheers. Karen's face tightened, but she pushed ahead to the next item: non-resident deliveries. She repeated her arguments. "We can't let random volunteers flood our streets thrice weekly. We must regulate them or require a fee for repeated entry." Her words faced a chorus of boos. Ms. Calloway stood to address the board, again warning that restricting a legitimate meal delivery service was legally perilous. Ms. Thompson also spoke, tearful but resolute. "How can you demand a fee for people who bring me my lunch? This is immoral." Ms. Tran cut in, stating she saw no reason to hamper the meal deliveries. Mr. Crosby seconded that. Ms. Green insisted the board uphold the earlier directive allowing free access. Mr. Dewey, again wavering, said, "Karen, we already resolved this last time." Karen refused to yield, insisting, "We have to finalize the matter with an official bylaw amendment." But no one else joined her. The board reaffirmed that meals could continue unrestricted. Another wave of applause erupted, and Karen's scowl deepened. At that point, Ms. Green took the microphone to share an additional piece of business. A recall petition has been circulated among homeowners. It has garnered significant support. We have the required threshold to call a special election, presumably next month, to determine if Ms. Whitfield will remain president. A hush fell over the room. Karen's eyes widened in fury, her knuckles gripping the gavel. Ms. Green concluded, "Given the events of recent weeks, the community has spoken. We'll follow the bylaws for a recall vote." Meeting adjourned. Karen slammed the gavel down, ignoring the calls of neighbors wanting to speak to her. She gathered her belongings and rushed out. Meanwhile, the crowd buzzed with excitement. Many approached Ms. Thompson, congratulating her. The senior advocacy group shook Ms. Green's hand, grateful the board upheld the meal program. Angela from Meals of Mercy thanked everyone for standing up for the seniors. I left with a light heart, sensing the final blow to Karen's tyranny was near. Over the next few weeks, the recall process moved swiftly. The board scheduled the special election for a Saturday afternoon at the community center. All Maplewood Grove residents in good standing could vote in person or by proxy. Ms. Green explained how the petition had well over the minimum required signatures, indicating broad dissatisfaction with Karen. The gating fiasco, the blockade against meal deliveries, and the avalanche of petty violations had eroded her support. Karen tried to defend herself, sending out flyers insisting that she was only trying to protect the neighborhood. She repeated fear-based arguments about strangers, security, and property values. She claimed the negative press was lies, orchestrated by a few troublemakers. However, with local media coverage continuing, few believed her spin. In fact, reporters did follow-up stories praising how the neighborhood stood up for seniors. Public sympathy was overwhelmingly on the senior side. On recall day, lines formed outside the community center from early morning. The mood felt like a determined push for change. Seniors came in wheelchairs or with walkers, determined to cast their vote. Younger residents who disliked Karen's petty oversight also showed up, many wearing buttons reading, "Meals equals compassion." Meanwhile, Karen stationed herself near the entrance, handing out a last-ditch brochure titled, "Don't Let Outsiders Take Over." But few paused to read it. By evening, the votes were tallied. Ms. Green announced the result. Out of 312 valid ballots, 230 voted to remove Ms. Karen Whitfield as HOA president, 82 voted to retain. The motion to recall passes. A loud cheer erupted. Some people cried tears of relief, hugging each other. Ms. Thompson, in the corner, offered a trembling smile, seeing the end of her tormentor's reign. The local newspaper reporter snapped photos, capturing the jubilant scene. Karen, red-faced, refused to address the crowd, storming out just as she had at previous meetings. Thus ended her presidency. According to the bylaws, Karen remained a homeowner but lost any official power. The board quickly appointed Ms. Green as interim president, pledging more transparent, compassionate leadership. The fiasco that began with meal deliveries had culminated in a seismic shift in Maplewood Grove's governance. In the aftermath, Karen faced more repercussions. While she was no longer president, she continued living in Maplewood Grove. But her standing among neighbors plummeted. People she once intimidated now ignored her or openly criticized her. The board withdrew the petty violation notices she'd issued, invalidating them as targeted harassment. Ms. Green formed a committee to rewrite certain rules, clarifying that charitable services like meal deliveries were exempt from vendor regulations. Karen's attempts to protest fell on deaf ears. With the local media praising Maplewood Grove seniors for triumphing over an overzealous HOA president, Karen found herself socially isolated. The senior advocacy group stated they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood to ensure no future sabotage of the meal program. Angela from Meals of Mercy told me volunteers felt much more welcome, no longer anxious about blockades or harassment. Some rumors swirled that Karen might sue the HOA for wrongful removal, but she lacked grounds. The recall followed the bylaws to the letter, and public sentiment was overwhelmingly against her. Another rumor suggested she might sell her house and move. Ms. Thompson shrugged at the rumor, telling me, "I don't wish her ill, but if she leaves, we'll have more peace." Ultimately, the new board declared that any future attempts by Karen to hamper charitable deliveries would be met with official condemnation and possible legal action. Freed from Karen's meddling, Maplewood Grove returned to its quiet suburban routine, only now with a more compassionate, neighborly spirit. Once Karen was deposed, Maplewood Grove truly embraced the Meals of Mercy program. More seniors signed up, discovering they could receive balanced meals thrice weekly. Younger residents volunteered to help carry meals indoors or check on neighbors. The community seemed to relish the sense of solidarity that grew from this shared crisis. Ms. Green championed a Neighbors Helping Neighbors initiative, encouraging volunteerism and compassion over rigid rule enforcement. With that shift, Maplewood Grove's image in the media changed too. An updated news segment highlighted how the neighborhood overcame hostility to support its seniors. Ms. Thompson was interviewed again, beaming, "I never believed people would fight so hard to ensure I wasn't forgotten." The local newspaper ran a feel-good story, from barricade to benevolence, how one neighborhood put seniors first. Meanwhile, Karen retreated from the spotlight. She rarely attended community events, and when she did venture out, neighbors greeted her with cold civility or avoided her entirely. She was left with the knowledge that her attempt to secure the neighborhood by blocking meal deliveries had backfired spectacularly, costing her power and respect. Over time, it was rumored that she listed her house. Some speculated she'd depart quietly for a new place, hopefully with fewer charitable outsiders to vex her. On a personal level, I felt immense relief. The program I helped coordinate was thriving. The volunteer drivers no longer faced harassment or threats of fines. The seniors flourished. Mrs. Thompson's health improved with consistent nutrition, and she eventually started walking around the block with renewed energy. The entire fiasco proved that even an entrenched HOA Karen couldn't stand against a united community determined to do the right thing. Though the immediate crisis ended, Maplewood Grove carried the lessons forward. The new board reevaluated several archaic bylaws that gave the HOA president disproportionate power. They introduced amendments ensuring the board must vote on major enforcement actions or rule changes, preventing any single person from imposing barriers or fines unilaterally. Ms. Green oversaw a more transparent approach to rulemaking. Residents felt heard, not dictated to. The seniors' meal deliveries, once threatened, became a celebrated fixture. On certain holidays, volunteers even brought festive cookies or mini-cakes. Some neighbors started pitching in to add personal touches, like holiday cards for the seniors. If a volunteer car was spotted on the street, neighbors waved. The fear of outsiders melted away, replaced by gratitude for the help they brought. Ms. Calloway and the senior advocacy group remained on cordial terms with Maplewood Grove, praising the new leadership for championing seniors' rights. A small volunteer coalition formed within the neighborhood, occasionally delivering groceries or offering rides to doctors' appointments. The fiasco ironically forged a stronger sense of community and empathy, something that had been lacking under Karen's strict regime. As for Karen, her ultimate punishment was fourfold: removal from HOA presidency via a decisive recall vote, loss of influence and social standing among neighbors, public condemnation in local media as the obstructor of a vital charity service, potential relocation, as rumors suggested she listed her home for sale to escape the neighborhood that no longer tolerated her meddling. In effect, she reaped the consequences of her intransigence. By obstructing a charitable service, she became the symbol of cruelty that Maplewood Grove's residents united to defeat. Months later, Maplewood Grove's metamorphosis was evident. People seemed friendlier, open to helping each other. Even minor bylaw enforcements were handled with empathy, like a gentle reminder rather than a barrage of fines. The board introduced a good neighbor initiative, encouraging block parties, volunteer drives, and shared resources. Meals of Mercy deliveries continued seamlessly. Seniors glowed with appreciation, often saying these interactions gave them not just food, but hope and connection. Ms. Thompson, in particular, revived her passion for writing letters. She penned heartfelt notes to the volunteers, thanking them for proving that kindness can triumph over selfish rules. Looking back, I realized the irony. Karen's attempt to isolate the neighborhood ironically bound us closer together. By rallying to help seniors, residents discovered a sense of unity more powerful than any regulation. The final blow to Karen's authority wasn't just the recall, it was the shift in heart throughout Maplewood Grove. People rejected fear and insularity, embracing compassion and cooperation. One cool autumn afternoon, I strolled the neighborhood, admiring the bright maple leaves drifting on the breeze. A Meals of Mercy car pulled up, a new volunteer stepping out with a warm smile, greeting a grateful senior at the door. No barricades, no hostility. Just neighbors helping neighbors. I felt a swell of pride, thinking of how far we'd come from the day Karen tried to blockade the street. As for Karen, I rarely saw her anymore. Some said she spent days holed up in her house, curtains drawn, possibly stewing over her downfall. Others said she was finalizing a move. Whichever the case, her reign was over. The community she once tried to rule with an iron fist had passed judgment. Generosity and decency trumped petty authoritarianism. Thus ended the saga of how HOA Karen tried to ban a charity meal service, only to be undone by the unstoppable force of public conscience. Her final punishment? The knowledge that her name would forever be associated with cruelty toward seniors in the annals of Maplewood Grove's history. Meanwhile, the rest of us moved on, stronger and more united, forging a neighborhood that truly lived up to its promise of neighborly care and compassion.